Imagine a single drop of water falling into a still pond. The ripples move outward, touching every corner, until the whole surface is alive with motion. Now imagine the human heart as that drop of water. One act of compassion, one genuine pulse of kindness, can ripple outward, touching lives in ways we may never fully see. This is the hidden power of a single heartbeat. We often underestimate the influence of our hearts. We believe change must come from leaders, from governments, from great movements that shake the foundations of society. Yet the Buddha reminded us again and again, transformation begins within. A single compassionate heart can calm not only itself, but the entire world around it. Think of a time when someone looked at you with true understanding, when their eyes held no judgment, only warmth. Maybe it was a friend who listened when you were in pain, or a stranger who smiled at you on a day when everything felt heavy. That moment may have seemed small, almost invisible to the world, but within you something shifted. Your breath deepened, your body softened, the storm inside you quieted. This is compassion in its purest form, not pity, not condescension, but the deep recognition that another being suffers just as we do, and the willingness to respond with care. In Buddhism, we call this karuna, compassion, one of the four immeasurable qualities of the awakened heart. Alongside loving kindness, empathetic joy, and equanimity, compassion is the force that turns our practice outward, making it not only personal but universal. And here lies a truth both profound and simple. When one heart is filled with compassion, it changes the entire field of reality around it. History gives us endless reminders. The Buddha himself once encountered Angulimala, a feared murderer who had taken countless lives. Many would have met such a man with hatred or fear, but the Buddha met him with compassion. Instead of raising a weapon, he raised his heart. And in that meeting, Angulimala's rage dissolved. A violent storm gave way to stillness. One compassionate heart not only saved lives but transformed a killer into a monk. That is the power of a single heartbeat. And it is not a power reserved for saints or sages. It lives within all of us. Each time we choose to soften instead of harden, to understand instead of condemn, we send ripples into the world. A child grows calmer because a parent speaks gently. A workplace becomes lighter because one person practices patience. A community heals because neighbors choose kindness over suspicion. Compassion does not require us to fix all the world's problems. It simply asks us to be present, to touch suffering with tenderness instead of indifference. And when we do, we discover something extraordinary. Compassion not only heals others, it heals us. Modern science echoes this timeless truth. Studies show that acts of compassion reduce stress, boost the immune system, and even lengthen lifespan. The heart rate slows, the mind clears, the body thrives. It is as if compassion is the medicine both the giver and the receiver have been longing for. But beyond the science, beyond the stories, lies a mystery that words can barely touch. The way compassion changes the very energy of a moment. Imagine two people arguing, voices rising, faces burning red. Then one person pauses, breathes, and says softly, "I see you're hurt." Suddenly the walls crack, tears replace anger, healing begins. That shift is invisible to the eyes but undeniable to the soul. In a world filled with noise, division, and endless struggle, this truth feels almost radical. A compassionate heart can calm the whole world. Not through force, not through control, but through presence. So let us begin here with the pulse of one human heart. Yours, mine, ours. Because the world does not change through ideas alone. It changes through the living practice of compassion, moment by moment, heartbeat by heartbeat. And as we open this journey together, let us listen closely. Somewhere beneath the chaos, beneath the stories we tell ourselves, beneath the anger and fear, there is a steady rhythm. A rhythm that connects you to me to you, and all of us to every living being. The rhythm of compassion, the heartbeat that can calm the world. If compassion can calm the world, then we must ask, what is compassion truly? In our everyday language, people often confuse compassion with pity. Pity looks down from above. It says, "You are weak and I am strong." But compassion does not stand above anyone. Compassion kneels down beside suffering, looks into its eyes, and whispers, "I am with you." This distinction matters because pity creates distance while compassion creates connection. Pity makes the other smaller. Compassion makes both whole. In Buddhism, compassion, karuna, is not an optional emotion we feel when convenient. It is one of the four immeasurable states of the heart, the qualities so vast that they cannot be limited by time, by place, or by individual preference. Alongside metta, loving kindness, mudita, joy in the happiness of others, and upekkha, equanimity, compassion is the great bridge between our inner practice and the world outside. To understand compassion in Buddhism is to realize it is not sentimental softness. It is not fragile or weak. True compassion is fierce in its gentleness, unwavering in its strength. It is the courage to face suffering without turning away. Think of Avalokitesvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, known across cultures as Guanyin, Kannon, or Chenrezig. In countless temples, we see this figure with 1,000 arms, each holding a tool to save beings, each hand open with an eye in its palm. The message is clear. Compassion sees suffering everywhere, and compassion reaches everywhere. It is both watchful and active, tender and unshakable. And yet, compassion is not only for great beings or celestial bodhisattvas. The Buddha taught that every human heart holds the seed of karuna. The question is whether we water it. How do we know compassion is alive within us? We feel it in the small shifts of the heart. When we see a wounded bird and our hand instinctively wants to help. When a child cries and our body moves to comfort. When a stranger struggles and something inside whispers. Do not ignore this. Compassion is not measured by the size of the act, but by the sincerity of the heart. A glass of water offered to the thirsty may carry more truth than a fortune given with pride. But here lies another subtle truth. Compassion does not mean drowning in another's pain. To be compassionate is not to carry every burden until we collapse. Buddhism teaches us balance. If we fall into despair when seeing suffering, that is not compassion but sorrow. If we look away, that is indifference. Compassion walks the middle path. It sees suffering clearly, feels it deeply, and acts with wisdom. This is why compassion is paired with equanimity. Imagine a doctor treating a sick child. If the doctor panics, she cannot help. If she feels nothing, she is cold. But if she combines deep care with calm clarity, she becomes truly effective. That is compassion in its awakened form. The Buddha once said, "All tremble at violence, all fear death." Putting yourself in the place of another, one should not kill nor cause another to kill. Here lies the heart of karuna, recognizing ourselves in every being. Their fear is our fear. Their longing for happiness is our own. Compassion dissolves the illusion of separation. And when this illusion dissolves, we see that our life is not just ours. Every heartbeat echoes in the lives of others. Every choice sends ripples far beyond what the eye can follow. This is the true meaning of compassion in Buddhism, the awakening of the heart to the truth of interconnection. Not pity, not sentimentality, but the lived recognition that to care for others is to care for ourselves, and to harm others is to harm ourselves. The moment we see this, the world changes. The beggar on the street is no longer a stranger but a reflection of our own vulnerability. The enemy is no longer a monster but a being trapped in suffering, just as we have been. Even the smallest insect crawling across the floor becomes a reminder that all beings cling to life with the same fragile hope. And when we understand this truth, not only with the mind but with the whole heart, compassion becomes as natural as breathing. When a single candle is lit in a dark room, the darkness does not fight back. It simply disappears. And when that candle lights another, and then another, soon the entire room glows with warmth. Compassion works in exactly this way, quietly, naturally, irresistibly. We often think our small acts of kindness are too insignificant to matter, yet compassion never remains contained within the heart of the giver. Like ripples on a pond, it radiates outward, touching lives we may never even meet. Consider the story of a simple smile. A woman, exhausted after a long day, waits in line at a grocery store. The cashier greets her not with boredom but with genuine warmth. That small gesture softens her mood. She goes home lighter, speaks gently to her children, and they, in turn, go to bed with calmer hearts. The next morning, those children step into school with more patience, more kindness to share with their friends. None of them realize that a single smile at a grocery counter set the ripples in motion. Buddhism has long recognized this law of interdependence. The Buddha taught that all beings are connected like threads in an endless net, each jewel reflecting the light of every other. When one shines, the whole net glows. When one suffers, the vibration is felt across the web. Compassion is the energy that turns this truth into lived experience. And it is not only human hearts that respond. Animals sense it. Nature feels it. Have you ever noticed how a frightened animal calms when met with a gentle presence? Or how even plants thrive when cared for with love? Compassion is not bound by species, language, or culture. It is the universal language of life itself. History offers countless examples of how one person's compassion transformed communities. Think of the Buddha himself, whose heart radiated so strongly that entire kingdoms found peace in his presence. Think of Mahatma Gandhi, whose philosophy of nonviolence arose from the deep well of compassion, inspiring millions to resist oppression without hatred. Or more quietly, think of the teacher who listens patiently to a struggling student, awakening a confidence that will ripple through that child's entire future. The power of compassion is that it multiplies. One act inspires another, until what began as a single heartbeat becomes a chorus. Anger spreads quickly, but compassion spreads deeper. Violence may shake the world, but compassion steadies it again. And this ripple effect is not only external, it begins within us. When we choose compassion, we change our own nervous system. Our body softens, our breath deepens, our mind clears. That inner shift radiates into our voice, our gestures, our presence. Without even speaking, we transmit calm to those around us. Neuroscience now confirms what the sages knew. Emotions are contagious. The peace in one heart can be felt in another, silently, powerfully. But here is the wonder. We never know how far the ripples go. A kind word spoken today may echo in someone's life years from now. A moment of patience on the highway may prevent an accident. A gentle correction instead of harsh criticism may inspire someone to grow instead of giving up. Compassion is like planting seeds in a field we may never walk through, but the harvest will feed generations. In a world so often torn by fear and division, it can be easy to believe that our kindness is too small to matter. But Buddhism teaches the opposite. A compassionate heart is never wasted. Every act, however small, adds to the great ocean of mercy that holds all beings. So let us not underestimate the ripples we create. The way we speak to one another, the way we treat the waiter, the stranger, the neighbor, the way we respond in moments of conflict. Each choice is a drop in the pond of existence. Each drop carries the power to calm, to heal, to awaken. And when many drops fall together, the ripples become waves. Waves that can wash over anger, dissolve hatred, and reveal the stillness that lies beneath. Hatred is like fire. It burns fiercely, consuming everything in its path. Yet even the most violent flames cannot survive without fuel. Remove the fuel and the fire dies. Compassion is that removal. It takes away the fuel that hatred feeds upon. But how does this work in real life, when anger feels so overwhelming, when hatred seems so unstoppable? The answer lies in the stories of those who faced hatred not with violence, but with compassion, and discovered its extraordinary power. One of the most striking examples comes from the life of the Buddha himself. During his time, a feared bandit roamed the forests of India. His name was Angulimala, which means the man with a garland of fingers. He had killed so many that he wore their severed fingers as a necklace around his neck. Villages trembled at the mention of his name. The government had declared him beyond saving. Most believed that only death could stop him. But when Angulimala encountered the Buddha, something unexpected happened. Instead of running away or raising a weapon, the Buddha walked calmly toward him. Angulimala shouted, demanding he stop, yet the Buddha's pace remained steady. When the bandit caught up, panting and furious, the Buddha simply said, "I have stopped, Angulimala. You stop too." Confused, the killer asked what he meant, and the Buddha explained, "I have stopped harming. I have stopped violence, but you have not." In that moment, something pierced Angulimala's heart more deeply than any blade could. The compassion radiating from the Buddha was so pure, so fearless, that his hatred dissolved. The man who once took lives laid down his weapons, became a monk, and eventually reached enlightenment. What army could have achieved this? What punishment? Only compassion had the strength to transform a murderer into a saint. This story is not just legend, it is a mirror. It shows us that even the most hardened anger can melt when met with genuine compassion. Not always instantly, not always dramatically, but inevitably. Because hatred feeds on resistance. When we return fire with fire, the flames only grow. But when we meet anger with understanding, its fuel disappears. We see echoes of this truth in modern times. Nelson Mandela, after decades imprisoned in South Africa, emerged without hatred. Instead of seeking revenge, he led with forgiveness, transforming a nation torn apart by racism and violence. His compassion disarmed enemies who had once feared him. Even in small moments, the same principle applies. Picture a heated argument. Words are sharp, voices rising. Then one person pauses and says, "I hear your pain. I don't want to fight with you." Suddenly the tension shifts. Tears may replace shouting. The cycle of anger breaks. Compassion is not weakness. It takes far more strength to remain calm in the face of hostility than to lash out. To hold one's ground without hatred requires a courage that is rare, but deeply transformative. Buddhism teaches us that anger arises from suffering. When someone lashes out, it is because they are trapped in their own pain. Compassion sees beyond the harsh words, beyond the violent act, into the wounded heart beneath. It does not excuse wrongdoing, but it understands its roots. And in understanding, the possibility of healing appears. So when faced with hatred, we can ask ourselves, what does this person need beneath their anger? What pain drives their hostility? This shift of perception changes everything. Suddenly, the enemy is no longer a monster but a human being, lost, afraid, suffering, just as we sometimes are. This does not mean we allow harm or stay silent in the face of injustice. Compassion is not passive acceptance. It may mean speaking firmly, protecting others, drawing boundaries, but always without hatred. Just as a parent stops a child from running into traffic, compassion acts strongly when needed, but never with cruelty. When compassion stands before hatred, something miraculous happens. The fire begins to cool, and not only in the other, it cools in ourselves. Our own anger softens. Our own heart becomes lighter, because hatred harms not only its target, but its carrier. Each moment of rage burns us from within. Compassion is the only antidote. Imagine if more of us practiced this. Wars would not need to escalate. Conflicts at work would not spiral. Families would not break so easily. The world would still have anger, but it would not consume us, because compassion, once awakened, refuses to feed the flames. This is why the Buddha said, hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is an eternal law. The ripple of compassion does not stop at kindness and comfort. It extends into the very heart of conflict, where it proves its greatest strength. For it is easy to be compassionate when life is gentle. The true test is when we face the storm of anger and stand unmoved, offering calm instead of chaos. And when we do, the fire loses its fuel. The storm loses its power. And once again, compassion shows us that even in the face of hatred, peace is possible. There is a kind of medicine that does not come in bottles, that cannot be prescribed by doctors, and yet has the power to heal wounds too deep for the body alone. That medicine is compassion. When we think of healing, we often picture broken bones or physical illness. But the greatest suffering humans carry is not always visible. It lives in loneliness, in grief, in shame, in the silent weight that presses against the heart. And here, compassion is the balm that restores life. Imagine a child who has fallen, scraped her knee, and cries out in pain. The wound itself is small, but what brings the greatest comfort is not the bandage. It is the gentle voice of a parent, the arms that hold her close, the assurance that she is not alone. In that embrace, the tears stop and the pain softens. That is compassion's healing power. It does not erase the wound, but it transforms the experience of suffering. Buddhism teaches that compassion heals because it touches the root of suffering, the illusion of separation. When we feel alone in our pain, the burden is unbearable. But when someone meets us with compassion, the walls of isolation break down. Suddenly, the suffering is shared, and in that sharing, it lightens. Even modern science now confirms what the Buddha taught centuries ago. Research shows that compassionate acts release oxytocin, the hormone that calms the nervous system, lowers blood pressure, and strengthens the immune response. Compassion literally changes the chemistry of the body, making healing more possible. In hospitals, patients who feel cared for recover faster. People who practice compassion meditation report lower stress, deeper sleep, and greater resilience. But beyond the science lies a mystery that is deeply human. Compassion heals not only the receiver, but also the giver. When we open our hearts to the pain of another, something within us softens too. The hardened walls of ego begin to crumble and we rediscover our own humanity. In helping others, we ourselves are healed. Think of the Buddha's disciples. Many came to him not as saints, but as broken individuals, grieving mothers, lost wanderers, men consumed by anger or fear. What drew them to the path was not only his wisdom, but his compassion. He looked into their suffering without judgment, with eyes that said, "I see you. You matter." And in that gaze, healing began. Even the smallest act of compassion can have this effect. A kind word spoken to someone in despair may save their life. A listening ear offered to a friend in grief may ease years of silent suffering. Compassion does not need to fix the problem. It heals simply by being present. This healing power is not limited to others. It extends inward as well. Often we are harshest with ourselves, carrying guilt, regret, and self-criticism like heavy stones. But when we learn to meet our own pain with compassion, something miraculous happens. The inner war begins to cease. We no longer fight ourselves. Instead, we cradle our wounds with tenderness like a mother holding a crying child. And in that moment, we discover that self-compassion is not selfish. It is the very foundation of all healing. Buddhist practice offers us ways to cultivate this. In Metta Bhavana, or loving-kindness meditation, we begin by sending kindness to ourselves, then to loved ones, then to strangers, and finally to all beings. As we do, the heart gradually learns a new rhythm. Instead of tightening in fear or judgment, it relaxes in compassion. This shift changes not only the mind, but the entire body, making healing possible on every level. Compassion also heals relationships. How many conflicts could end if one person chose understanding instead of pride? How many families could reconcile if compassion were offered instead of blame? Healing begins the moment someone says, "I am willing to listen. I am willing to care." And on a larger scale, compassion has the power to heal nations. Communities torn by violence can begin to rebuild when compassion replaces vengeance. Survivors of tragedy can move forward when met with genuine care. The world's greatest wounds are not solved by policies alone, but by the human heart awakening to compassion. The healing power of compassion is not magic, it is natural law. Just as water soothes fire, compassion soothes suffering. It may not erase pain, but it transforms the way pain is carried. It changes despair into resilience, fear into trust, wounds into wisdom. And perhaps the greatest secret of all is this. When we practice compassion, we realize that healing is not something we give to others. It is something that flows through us, touching all sides, leaving no one untouched. So when the world feels heavy, when the wounds seem endless, remember this: you may not heal everything, but your compassion can heal something. And in healing something, you help heal the whole. We often imagine compassion as something reserved for saints, monks, or great leaders. We picture vast temples, selfless sacrifices, or heroic gestures. Yet the truth is far simpler and perhaps more beautiful. Compassion lives in the small, ordinary acts of daily life. Think of the way a stranger holds the door for someone carrying heavy bags, or the moment a driver pauses to let another merge into traffic with a smile instead of a scowl. These acts will never make headlines, but they carry a quiet power. They soften hearts. They remind us that goodness still exists. They create ripples we may never see, but which move out into the world nonetheless. The Buddha often emphasized this simplicity. He taught that the path is not about grand displays of virtue, but about the way we live each moment. A kind word, a gentle gesture, a patient silence. These are the threads that weave compassion into the fabric of daily life. Consider a teacher who notices a child struggling. Instead of scolding, she kneels beside the desk, offers encouragement, and helps the child see their own potential. That small moment may be forgotten by the teacher, but for the child, it could be the spark that changes their entire future. Or think of a nurse sitting by a patient's bed at night, holding their hand when fear makes sleep impossible. The medicine may heal the body, but that touch heals the heart. Even within our own homes, compassion transforms everything. A spouse who chooses to listen instead of argue. A parent who bends down to comfort instead of dismiss. A sibling who forgives instead of holding a grudge. These small acts may seem ordinary, but they are the lifeblood of peace. Buddhism calls this skillful action. We may not always be able to change someone's circumstances, but we can always change the way we show up. Compassion is not about fixing. It's about being present, being willing to share in the weight of another's suffering, even if only for a moment. And what is remarkable is how these tiny choices accumulate. One kind word can change a conversation. One conversation can change a relationship. One relationship can change a community. The entire direction of a life can shift because someone chose compassion in an ordinary moment. Science affirms this ripple too. Studies show that witnessing an act of kindness, even if we are not directly involved, increases our own likelihood of acting kindly. In other words, compassion is contagious. One spark can ignite many others, until a small flame becomes a fire of goodness. But perhaps the most overlooked form of daily compassion is the one we offer ourselves. Too often we push through exhaustion, ignore our limits, or criticize ourselves harshly. But when we pause to rest, to forgive, to treat ourselves gently, we cultivate the same healing energy we give to others. Self-compassion is the foundation upon which all other compassion rests. Without it, we risk burning out. With it, our compassion flows freely. So the question is not whether we can change the world through compassion. The question is whether we are willing to begin with the small, the ordinary, the everyday. Holding the elevator for someone, listening without interrupting, offering a genuine smile, writing a kind message, choosing patience in a moment of frustration. These are not small things. They are the seeds of peace planted in the soil of human connection. And just as a single drop of water nourishes the earth, these small acts nourish the soul of humanity. Compassion in daily life is not about waiting for the perfect moment. It is about realizing that every moment is the perfect moment. Every breath offers the chance to soften. Every interaction offers the chance to care. And when we live this way, compassion is no longer an ideal we admire. It becomes the rhythm of our days, the unseen current shaping everything we touch. There is a profound truth at the heart of Buddhism. The highest spiritual calling is not to escape the world, but to serve it. This is the Bodhisattva ideal, living not only for ourselves, but for the awakening and well-being of all beings. The word Bodhisattva means a being of awakening. But it is more than a title. It is a vow, a way of life. The Bodhisattva sees the suffering of the world and instead of turning away, makes a promise. I will not seek liberation for myself alone. I will walk the path until every being is free. It is the ultimate expression of compassion. Imagine standing at the gates of liberation, freedom already within reach, and then turning back because you cannot bear to leave anyone behind. That is the heart of the Bodhisattva. Buddhism offers many stories of such beings. Avalokiteshvara, the embodiment of compassion, is said to have vowed never to rest until every being was freed from suffering. When he saw the immense weight of the world's pain, his body shattered from grief. Yet from those fragments, new forms arose, so he could continue his mission in countless ways, never giving up on us. This is not mythology alone. It is a mirror for our own potential. Each of us carries a spark of the Bodhisattva spirit. Whenever we choose to help another before ourselves, whenever we endure discomfort so that someone else may have peace, whenever we live with the intention to uplift rather than compete, we step into that ideal. But let's be honest, living for others is not easy. Our culture often tells us that happiness comes from accumulation, self-interest, or winning over others. The Bodhisattva path offers a radical alternative. Joy comes from giving, from sharing, from easing another's burden. And what's astonishing is that science echoes this truth. Studies show that people who give their time, energy, or resources to help others report greater happiness, deeper meaning, and even better health. Compassion doesn't just heal the world, it heals the one who practices it. Yet the Bodhisattva ideal goes beyond kindness. It asks us to widen our circle of care. Not just to love those who love us, but to extend compassion to strangers, to those we dislike, even to those who cause harm. It is a courage that says, "Your suffering is my suffering too." Imagine if even a fraction of humanity lived this way. Leaders who prioritize the well-being of the people over their own power. Communities where the strong carried the weak instead of exploiting them. Families where forgiveness replaced resentment. The ripple effect would be unimaginable. And here's the beautiful part. This ideal is not distant. It is not reserved for monks or saints. It is present in the mother who sacrifices sleep for her child, in the friend who stays up all night to comfort someone in despair, in the volunteer who gives without expecting recognition. These are the everyday bodhisattvas walking among us. The bodhisattva ideal is not about perfection. It is about direction. Each act of compassion, no matter how small, points us toward a life where our joy is bound up with the joy of others. To live for others is to recognize that we are not separate. The happiness of one is intertwined with the happiness of all. The suffering of one echoes through the whole. In this way, compassion is not just an act. It is the very fabric of reality calling us to awaken. And so, the Bodhisattva's vow becomes a guiding star. May I be a refuge for the weary. May I be a light in the darkness. May I live not for myself alone, but for the liberation of all. It is a vow that stretches across lifetimes, but it begins right here in this very moment with a single choice: to open our heart. The Bodhisattva vow feels timeless, but what does it look like in our fast, noisy, modern world? Today, we live in an age of dazzling technology, global connection, and endless information. Yet beneath the glow of our screens, many hearts feel lonelier than ever. Anxiety, depression, and division are rising. The world has never been more connected, and yet, paradoxically, never more fragmented. Here is where compassion becomes not only relevant but essential. In the workplace, we are taught to compete, to climb, to prove our worth. But what if compassion entered that space? Imagine a manager who listens to an overworked employee instead of dismissing their struggles, or a colleague who shares credit rather than hoards it. In that small shift, stress softens, creativity blooms, and workplaces become not just productive but humane. On social media, anger spreads like wildfire. A single cruel comment can spiral into storms of hatred, but compassion can shift the tide. It could be as simple as pausing before we type, remembering that behind every profile is a living, breathing human being with fears and dreams like our own. A kind comment, a patient response, or even choosing silence can redirect an entire conversation. And consider our cities. Busy streets, crowded subways, endless traffic. It is easy to feel invisible in the rush, yet compassion shows up in surprising ways. The stranger who gives up their seat, the driver who lets another pass, the shopkeeper who greets with genuine warmth. These tiny gestures are like lanterns in the dark, guiding us back to our shared humanity. Modern science now speaks the language of what Buddhism has always taught. Compassion is not just a virtue. It rewires the brain, lowers stress, strengthens immunity, and deepens happiness. Neuroscientists call it the care network, a part of the brain that lights up when we act with kindness. Compassion, it turns out, is not only moral, it is medicinal. But compassion in the modern world also means confronting global challenges. Climate change, inequality, violence. These are not problems that any one person can solve alone. Yet compassion changes how we face them. Instead of despair, we feel responsibility. Instead of indifference, we feel connection. Each of us, in our own small ways, can live in a manner that lessens harm and nurtures life. And perhaps the greatest challenge of our era is division. Us versus them, my side versus yours. Compassion does not erase our differences, but it bridges them. It asks, can we see beyond labels, beyond opinions, to the shared longing at the core of every heart, to be safe, to be understood, to be loved? The modern world is fast, but compassion slows it down. The modern world is noisy, but compassion listens. The modern world is fractured, but compassion heals. And so, the practice remains the same as it was in the Buddha's time. To cultivate a heart that meets each being with kindness, no matter the setting. Whether through a screen or face-to-face, in crowded cities or quiet villages, compassion is timeless because human need is timeless. If anything, the modern world makes compassion even more urgent. For in an age where we can reach across continents in a single moment, every act of kindness has the power to echo further than ever before. Compassion is not about going back to a simpler world. It is about bringing timeless wisdom into the world we live in today, messy, chaotic, but still filled with opportunities to care. And in choosing compassion, we become anchors in the storm, steady lights guiding others through the turbulence of modern life. Compassion is not just a feeling that appears out of nowhere. It is a seed, and like any seed, it must be nurtured. Some imagine compassion as a gift given only to a few rare souls, but the Buddha taught that every human being carries the capacity for compassion, just as every acorn holds the potential for a mighty oak. The question is not whether we have it, but whether we are willing to cultivate it. So how do we do this? How do we grow a heart that meets the world with kindness instead of judgment, with patience instead of anger? The first step is awareness. We cannot offer compassion if we do not see suffering. In daily life, we often rush past others, absorbed in our own concerns. But when we pause and notice, the tired eyes of a cashier, the frustration of a coworker, the quiet sadness in a friend's voice, we begin to awaken the soil where compassion can take root. The second step is empathy. Empathy means allowing ourselves to feel with another, even if only for a moment. It is the simple but profound recognition. Your pain is not separate from mine. This does not mean drowning in someone else's suffering, but rather opening our hearts enough to care, to understand. From awareness and empathy, compassion naturally arises. But to sustain it, we need practice. The Buddha gave us practical tools, the most famous being metta bhavana, or loving kindness meditation. In this practice, we sit quietly and send wishes of well-being, first to ourselves, then to loved ones, then to strangers, and even to those we find difficult. Over time, the circle expands until it includes all beings. At first, the words may feel mechanical. May you be happy, may you be safe, may you be at peace. But slowly something shifts. The heart softens. The walls of self and other begin to crumble. What begins as practice becomes natural response. But compassion is not only built in meditation halls. It is forged in daily choices. We cultivate it every time we pause before speaking harshly. Every time we choose patience instead of anger. Every time we forgive instead of holding a grudge. Each moment is a training ground. Another essential aspect is self-compassion. Many of us speak to ourselves in ways we would never speak to another, harsh, critical, unforgiving. Yet the Buddha reminded us that to care for ourselves is not selfish. It is the foundation for caring for others. A heart hardened against itself cannot fully open to the world. But when we treat our own wounds with tenderness, we gain the strength to tend to the wounds of others. And here lies a paradox. The more we practice compassion, the more natural it becomes. The heart that once resisted begins to crave it, the way a plant leans toward the sun. We discover that compassion is not a burden but a liberation. It frees us from the prison of self-centeredness and connects us to something greater. Still, we must remember, cultivating compassion is a lifelong path. There will be moments when we fall short, when anger rises, when impatience takes over. But even these moments are opportunities. Each time we fail, we learn. Each time we try again, the roots grow deeper. So perhaps the best way to begin is simply this: one act of kindness every day. One conscious choice to meet the world with softness. Over weeks, months, years, these acts weave together into a life defined not by what we gained, but by how we cared. In this way, cultivating a compassionate heart is not about becoming someone different. It is about uncovering what has always been there, waiting beneath the surface. And when we nurture that heart, when compassion becomes the rhythm of our days, something remarkable happens. We discover that the very act of caring for others brings peace to ourselves. And in that peace, we find the strength to continue offering compassion, again and again, like a spring that never runs dry. If there is one truth that echoes through every story, every teaching, every moment we've shared, it is this: a compassionate heart is never small. It may live inside one person, but its reach extends far beyond what the eye can see. The Buddha once said, "Hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love." This is the eternal law. Compassion is that love. It is the medicine for anger, the bridge across division, the light that guides us when the world feels dark. We began with a simple idea. That one heartbeat filled with compassion can calm the whole world. And now, looking back, we see how true it is. Compassion transforms conflict into understanding. It heals wounds that logic alone cannot touch. It takes ordinary moments and makes them extraordinary. Think of the countless small acts that happen each day. Someone helping a neighbor, someone forgiving an old hurt, someone listening with patience instead of judgment. Most of these acts will never be noticed by history, but they are the hidden forces holding humanity together. And here lies the beauty. Compassion does not ask for perfection. It asks only that we begin, one choice, one word, one gesture at a time. Like drops of water filling a river, each act of kindness joins with countless others until it becomes an unstoppable current. The Bodhisattvas understood this. They chose to live not for themselves alone, but for all beings. And though their vow may seem vast, it begins the same way for us. Right here, right now, with the next breath, the next moment, the next opportunity to care. In this modern world, fast, divided, uncertain, we need compassion more than ever. Not as an abstract philosophy, but as a living practice. Compassion in the way we speak. Compassion in the way we listen. Compassion in the way we meet both friend and stranger, self and other. And perhaps most importantly, compassion in the way we remember our shared humanity. For beneath all differences, every heart beats with the same longing, to be safe, to be understood, to be loved. So let this be the legacy we leave. Not wealth, not titles, not monuments, but a ripple of compassion that continues long after we are gone. A world where future generations look back and say, they chose kindness, they chose care, they chose to live with open hearts. One heart may not seem like much, but when one heart opens, others follow. And when enough hearts awaken, the world itself begins to change. So let us carry this truth with us. Every act of compassion matters. Every moment of kindness counts. Every heartbeat has the power to calm the world. One heart, one world, and it begins with you. If these words touch something within you, let them stay in your heart a little longer. And if you wish to continue walking this path of wisdom and compassion, I invite you to join our community here at Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Subscribe, share, and let these teachings ripple outward, so together we can plant more seeds of peace in this restless world. May your heart be calm, your steps be gentle, and your compassion boundless. Until we meet again, may you walk in peace.